Welcome to today's webinar, Genetic Counseling. For this webinar, we have English and Spanish captions available. If you're joining us live on Zoom, please check the chat box as we're adding the instructions right now. And if you're watching the recording, you'll find the instructions in the video description on how to activate the subtitles. Please use the question and answer section for your questions. And I want to just add a quick comment that these presentations are live. And if we encounter any glitches with the tech, please be patient. You know that for the last couple of years through the pandemic, that technology doesn't always work as it should. And please be patient with our presenters as we work through anything unexpected. We want to thank our sponsor, Biogen, without whom our webinar series would not be possible. Thank you for your ongoing support of these webinars. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy Cummings. I'm the Executive Director of the International Alliance of ALS M&D Associations, and I'm joined today by an incredible guest who will be providing us with an overview of genetic counseling. I want to take the opportunity to highlight the importance of today's topic. The International Alliance supports the fundamental rights of people living with ALS-MND, and included in those rights for people living with ALS-MND are also rights for caregivers. In 2021, the rights were updated to include the piece that is highlighted by the box at the bottom of the screen, right number 11. People living with ALS-MND have the right to access upon diagnosis to up-to-date education about clinical genetics in ALS-MND, genetic counseling, genetic testing, safeguards against genetic discrimination, and subject to education and counseling, blood relatives should also be given the same access where relevant. I just want to pause on that right that was added in 2021 and really emphasize that a couple of things within the wording there. The fundamental right was debated by a large group of stakeholders in how we would add those words to the fundamental rights document. And there are a couple of key pieces that I think are worth mentioning. One is the words upon diagnosis. The International Alliance strongly supports that as soon as possible, if people make the decision to get genetic counseling and testing, that they have access to it, as close to diagnosis as possible. The other thing that I want to emphasize is the order of the words genetic counseling and testing. Another thing that the International Alliance believes in strongly is that genetic testing should always go hand in hand with genetic counseling. So we try and say the word counseling first in any sentence when we talk about genetic counseling and testing, so that the emphasis is on the counseling, and so that individuals are not acting in isolation with results, and they have access to genetic counseling. So I just wanted to emphasize those couple of pieces of the genetics counseling and testing fundamental right that we added to the fundamental rights of people living with ALS-MND. Last year, during the tail end of when we were still shut down for the pandemic, the Alliance ran a fundamental rights survey with responses from 32 different countries. And the results highlighted in most of the world, genetic counseling and testing is a relatively new topic. Availability and access to all genetic related areas is still very limited and only available to certain countries, with only 7% responding that they have access to a genetic counselor. That's a very, very low statistic. In this image, we've put together two graphs because we want to always talk about genetic counseling and testing together. We can clearly see the countries that are leading in offering of these services, but at the same time, the disparity is very large when we go to the countries at the bottom of the graph. This data raises a lot of questions that we won't be able to answer necessarily today, but we hope that this session and others like it about genetic counseling and testing will help in the education and importance of this very important topic. And one of the things that the Alliance believes in strongly around the world is to try and aspirationally raise access to all of the things that are in the fundamental rights, including genetic counseling and testing, so that graphs like the one that are shown on the screen become much more equitable around the world. So with that background in mind on the importance and the disparity around the world in genetic counseling and testing, I want to now introduce you to our presenter today, Ashley Crook. Ashley is a certified genetic counselor and PhD. And her PhD, actually, I think our intro about Ashley might not be quite accurate, so she can correct this. Her PhD thesis is currently under examination at the University of Technology, Sydney Graduate School of Health, and she works at the Macquarie University Centre for M&D Research and at Austin Health. Her PhD project used mixed methods to propose genetic counseling standards of practice for ALS, M&D, and FTD, and diagnostic genetic testing. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'm just going to get set up by sharing my slideshow. Thanks very much for attending and being interested in this topic, which is obviously very much of interest to me. I am going to go through a bit of a background, but I guess firstly, I really want to highlight, which Kathy has as well, that genetic counselling and testing do go hand in hand, but genetic counselling is something that always should be done, and genetic testing is something that is, well, it should be an option available for people. And I'll certainly go into that in a bit more detail as I move through the slides. So just a bit of an overview about what I was going to talk about today. I'm very conscious that I might have a range of different audiences listening here. So hopefully you will find something that will be of interest. So the first half, I'm going to be providing a bit of background information about what genetic counselling is, very brief introduction about the genetics of ALS MND, and then I'll go into the detail about the different types of genetic testing that are available, and a bit about my clinical and research background, which really informed the next part of the presentation on the genetic counselling considerations regarding genetic testing. And I hope that, you know, if you are someone who works with people with ALS MND, then perhaps this could be useful as kind of discussion points or other pieces of information. But also if you're a person with ALS MND or a family member of someone with ALS MND, then perhaps it could be useful for helping with those considerations about whether you wanted to access genetic counselling or testing. And as Kathy has also said as well, certainly access to genetic counselling and testing varies around the world. But even in Australia, where I am, there is certainly a range of different access availabilities. Genetic counselling is available in the public system, often with long wait lists, and genetic testing isn't always available in the public system for people with ALS MND. So it's important for me to highlight that. There might be very regional specific things that need to be considered when thinking about genetic counselling. I also hope there's time for questions at the end. So please, I do encourage you to ask questions, and hopefully I'll answer them along the way or at the end. So what is genetic counselling? It's a communication process that accompanies genetic testing and includes the following 4 goals. So interpretation of family and medical histories, education about the condition, support and resources, counselling to promote informed choices, and support to encourage the best possible adjustment. So as a genetic counsellor myself, I'm an allied health professional trained to provide all 4 components, but we know that many health professionals are involved in genetic counselling, and in this talk I'm referring to the genetic counselling provided by all different types of health professionals. Genetic counsellors aren't a recognised profession everywhere, so in some areas it's very commonplace for clinicians other than genetic counsellors to provide genetic counselling. And I know this audience will know what ALS is, but I wanted to flag with this slide that the link with frontotemporal dementia. So these are two adult onset progressive neurodegenerative conditions with quite distinct clinical features, but we understand now that they form a continuum of disease, meaning that some people with ALS would have similar clinical features or overlapping features with FTD, or overlapping genetic features or pathology features. And what we currently understand is that at least 20% of people with MND or FTD, unselected for family history, will have an underlying disease-causing genetic variant. So I'll talk about that over the coming slides as well. It is important to note that overall, if you are more likely to have an underlying disease-causing variant if there is a family history, but we are starting to see that there are people who don't have a strong suggestive family history who would also have a disease-causing variant. So because of that, as Kathy outlined, the Alliance, as part of the fundamental rights, genetic counselling and testing is emerging in the care of all people with ALS and MND. It is, however, not standard in many locations, and there are differences between countries, but even within countries. There was a recent study that was conducted, and I just poached this directly from the study, where it highlights that lack of family history or, certain ages of onset should not be a barrier to genetic testing in ALS. And from my point of view, and I think this should be a consistent agreement, genetic counselling is an opportunity to discuss the option of genetic testing or options such as DNA storage, but it's important to note that genetic testing should never be mandatory. So when we are talking about genetic testing, I really want to highlight that not all genetic testing is the same. There are two, main categories of genetic testing that can be conducted. So the first is the initial search for a pathogenic variant, also known as a genetic fault, genetic change, or a mutation, to search to see whether one can be detected. And then once a pathogenic variant or gene change is detected, then there's direct testing available for relatives to determine whether they have inherited that gene change. So if I start by talking about the initial search, it's often called diagnostic testing. And in this process, the genetic testing involves looking at one or multiple genes to confirm whether a genetic change is present. In terms of whether you do look at one or multiple genes, that's a decision based on which laboratory you might choose, what is available, and also the pre-test likelihood of finding something. I'll talk about that a little bit later when I think about the considerations for genetic counselling as well. Overall, diagnostic testing is best done on someone with symptoms of the disease. There are more limitations of testing someone without disease history, but we are aware that sometimes we don't have access in a family to someone with ALS, MND, or that person may not actually wish to go ahead with testing. So it is possible that diagnostic testing in some circumstances could be conducted on someone who does not have a history of disease themselves, but could be at risk because of the family history. And there are three possible results from diagnostic testing. So the first two are a negative result, so where no genetic change is identified, or an uncertain significance result, where a change is found, but it's unclear if this change is just something that is part of our natural variation, or whether it is something that's actually significant and disease-causing. So when we get one of these two results, there's no direct testing available for relatives. And although the results may be reassuring that there is nothing there, we know that genetic testing is not perfect. And sometimes, even in families where there is a strong family history of ALS, MND, we are unable to find the genetic change based on our current technology that we use. And then finally, the third possible result is that we identify a gene change or gene fault pathogenic variant. And in that situation, we've got an explanation, or at least part of an explanation, for why disease occurred in that person. And we've got direct testing available for relatives, which I'll talk about next. The other thing to mention is that things are moving more towards there being possible access to clinical trials if a gene change is confirmed. Now, I'm not going into detail in today's presentation about all the different genes that have been, I guess, implicated in relation to ALS-MND, but there are several, and there are clinical trials available for certain genes, only a select few, and at certain kind of levels of knowledge and research. So phase 1 versus phase 3 trials, for example. So one example trial is tofersen, an antisense oligonucleotide therapy. So this has just come up since September of this year. An update on the trial results. There was a big article in BBC and many headlines, and there's also a really useful, I guess, summary from the MND Association of the UK, and I'll get the Alliance to paste in a link to that as well. So just about tofersen, just one example, that is a clinical trial available for certain people with certain genetic changes in the SOD1 gene. The SOD1 gene, depending on the population, does vary, but really would fit with, say, 1 to 2% of people with ALS-MND. So although clinical trials might be beneficial, genetic testing doesn't guarantee that a clinical trial would be available. And even so, of course, it doesn't guarantee that a clinical trial would actually show some positive outcomes. And even with tofersen, there's more research that is required to confirm. However, the kind of early outcomes have shown some promise in slowing disease progression in ALS-MND. And this is certainly an area where more genetic testing may be done in future when there are more clinical trials available, depending on someone's genetic testing result. So back onto direct testing, I'll talk now about, what happens then if there is a positive result. Well, then there's direct testing available for that specific genetic change in relatives. And I've got this image here, which is the autosomal dominant inheritance. So I've got a man and a woman and their 4 children, theoretically. So just say, for example, that the man has MND and has a SOD1 gene fault. So one SOD1 gene fault. We all carry 2 copies of these genes in autosomal dominant inheritance patterns. So this man has a faulty copy of SOD1 and a working copy of SOD1. His partner has 2 working copies of SOD1. And with their children, for each child, it's 50-50 whether or not that child's inherited the working copy or the faulty copy of the SOD1 gene. So that's where a lot of the genes associated with ALS-MND sit, with dominant inheritance. So if someone with ALS-MND is found to have a gene change, then for their children, it would be like flipping a coin for each of them, whether or not it's been inherited or not. And similarly, often it is the case that it's been in the family for generations, and other family members, siblings, cousins, etc., may also be at risk. So once we know that there is a gene change in the family, we can offer testing to other family members directly to know whether or not it's there. And this is known as predictive testing, and it's a yes or no answer. So yes or no, have they inherited the ALS-MND risk or the ALS-MND associated gene change known to be present in their family? And if it's yes, then they are at increased risk. Their risk would vary depending on the particular genetic change, and we may be able to be clear that perhaps the risk is likely to be close to 100% over their lifetime, or we may be quite uncertain about the meaning of that risk for them. There's also the possibility of clinical trials. This Atlas trial is one example, using tofersen in people who are pre-symptomatic. So that means people who have a SOD1 mutation, but have not developed any symptoms as yet. So that's what could happen, I guess, what you could know if you had a yes answer. But if you have a no, then you've not inherited that genetic change. Your risk would be similar to that of the general population, and you can't pass on that risk to next generation. So it kind of stops there. So for predictive testing, genetic counselling is an absolute necessity. And that's because, in my clinical experience, we know that more people choose not to find out whether they're at risk than they do to find out. There are pros and cons one way or another. For some people, it could be described as having sort of Damocles hanging over your head over your lifetime. But for others, even knowing about this potential genetic risk is, it's better to remove some uncertainty by knowing one way or another whether it's been inherited. And some people might use predictive testing, for example, to help plan their future, whether that's family planning, life planning, or other different aspects as well, which I'll go into a little bit more in the consideration section towards the end of this presentation. And then the final type of direct testing is reproductive testing. So this is similar to predictive testing in that it's direct testing for a gene change that's already been identified in the family. And it's looking to test an embryo through IVF or test a pregnancy to prevent that inherited risk being passed on to future generations. Now, this is absolutely region specific in terms of what is available, and that's certainly worth me flagging. Oh, sorry, I just went forward a little bit. The other thing to mention is that for some people who are planning a family who are aware of the risk of ALS MND or the gene in their family, then there is the option of considering exclusion testing as well, which is also region specific. And what I mean by that is that you could directly test a pregnancy or directly test through IVF without actually knowing your own result. So this is really a suitable option for some people who don't wish to know whether or not they have the gene change, but want to ensure that they can prevent the gene change being passed on to future generations. So I guess I've covered a little bit about genetic counselling, a little bit about genetic testing and ALS FTD. But I'll also talk a little bit about my interest in this area. So as said in the introduction, I'm a genetic counsellor, and I'd come across some situations in my clinical work where I identified that some people had difficulty accessing appropriate genetic counselling, including information and support, or they weren't able to access genetic testing. And through realising that, I looked into the research and identified there was no consistent approaches and limited research on genetic counselling for ALS, MND and FTD. So the goal of my PhD was to work towards developing a standard of practice on how we provide genetic counselling and testing. So just a quick summary of the 4 studies I conducted, and I think the Alliance will paste in quick links to all of these studies if anyone's interested. First, it was conducting 2 literature reviews to really establish what we already knew. So in the first, a systematic review, I took a broad approach to understand how current genetic counselling practices occurred in both ALS and FTD and other late onset neurodegenerative diseases. And then I looked specifically at ALS and FTD to understand, what are people's experiences and decision making about genetic counselling reported in the literature. From there, I was able to conduct some studies directly, and I narrowed my focus to focus specifically on diagnostic testing. So the initial testing done in a family to search for a pathogenic change, usually on someone with a diagnosis of ALS, MND or FTD. So in the third study, the qualitative study, I sought to understand the needs of people who had attended genetic counselling as clients for ALS and FTD. And I interviewed 18 people who were previous genetic counselling clients around Australia. And then in the Delphi study, this was a multi-round online survey where I proposed some key aspects of genetic counselling that I thought were important considerations. And then I received feedback from people with ALS, FTD, their family members, and representatives from support associations from Australia. And then I also had health professionals from Australia and around the world who conducted genetic counselling. So from there, I ended up with this proposed genetic counselling practice standards for diagnostic testing, which I won't go into detail in because I've covered most of them actually in the considerations that I'll discuss next anyway. I did want to highlight, so these are 16 dot points really that were highlighted as important for genetic counselling regarding diagnostic testing, but they're really the short form. So if we use the use, privacy and storage of results discussion items as an example, you can see here that we've kind of listed quite a bit of detail about the use, privacy and storage results and the discussion. So before arranging genetic testing, provide information about and gain consent for the use, privacy and storage of results now and in the future. This includes a discussion about whether results form part of the medical record, can be shared if the client passes away, and can be shared with family members or health professionals to provide accurate counselling to other family members. And a note that consent should be clearly recorded, and after the results are given, the above should be confirmed and clarified. So the idea with these practice standards is that they could be useful for people who are conducting genetic counselling with people with ALS MND and their family members around diagnostic testing. So I came up with some key findings from my PhD studies, which also informed how I think about the considerations that I'll detail next. So firstly, that client-centred care is essential. In other words, we may need to adapt how the appointment is run, who is involved, how much information, counselling and support is required, and at what time. And that's informed by a whole range of different circumstances specific to the person with ALS, MND, FTD or their family, the likelihood of detecting a pathogenic variant, and also what the results are. For many, but not all, the family is at the centre of genetic counselling experiences, and I'll go through that again when I talk about the considerations. And also that the standards of practice that we developed required both flexibility and rigidity. So the standards needed to be flexible and adaptable to the client's needs and varied health systems, and also resources availability, but also rigid enough to ensure that someone was making an informed and considered decision about genetic testing, and they'd considered all of the different aspects that I'll discuss next as well. Finally, that additional information and support resources could complement care. So on the topic of additional information and support resources, that's certainly something that I'm aware the Alliance is looking at doing. And another great resource that has just come out this year is Health Talk. There should be a link hopefully coming through the Zoom chat as well. So in Health Talk, there's an inherited motor neuron disease chapter, which actually interviews people with inherited motor neuron disease about different aspects about their experience. So how they made decisions about whether to go ahead with testing or not, what it was like to receive information, etc. So without further ado, I'm just looking at the time. I'll go through the considerations regarding all types of genetic testing. And what I've done here is I have lumped everything together. I think there are specific considerations that you might consider. For example, maybe not touching on as much for someone with who's got ALS, MND and going through diagnostic testing, and maybe there's a low chance of finding something, considering that, for example, in comparison to someone who's going through predictive testing who has a 50% chance of inheriting a pathogenic variant. But I think, as I've highlighted from my PhD studies, every counselling discussion should be client-centred, so that you can't be too rigid in any of the types of genetic testing. So hopefully the next few slides will go through the key considerations to think about when providing genetic counselling to help people really be informed and supported throughout. So the first is about providing information, but also exploring the following topics. So firstly, the genetic testing available and the conditions being tested for. So when we talk about the genetic testing available, that's about the testing process, all of the possible results from testing, what the cost might be, where that is relevant, the time frame for receiving results, and the limitations of testing. It's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that not all diagnostic testing is the same. So depending on the laboratory that is used, there may be different genes that are tested for, and there may be different levels of accuracy for what is detected. more genes does not necessarily mean a better result, and that's really something that needs to be considered. We know that there are really strong genes associated with MND, like C9orf72, SOD1, FUS, for example, and there might be some more newly discovered genes that maybe have less strong evidence and implication knowledge around that. So it's important to be aware of the available genetic testing and the limitations of what is available within that area. And the other thing to mention is that, when you do predictive testing, so direct testing for a specific genetic change, we need to absolutely make sure that we're testing for the right genetic change. It's like making sure you've got the right GPS spot available. And we also want to make sure that there is really strong evidence that that particular gene change is disease causing. So those are the types of things that we might think about in genetic counselling, and we can also rely on speaking to laboratories about their interpretations and understanding as well. And then in terms of the conditions being tested for, it's important to discuss how the condition is inherited. And as I said, it's usually autosomal dominant, meaning the 50-50 chance for children, and also the uncertainties. So for people with genetic forms of ALS-MND, for example, there are big uncertainties, even if you do have an underlying genetic variant, regarding what clinical symptoms might present, when they might present, and how quickly, for example, they may progress. And depending on the client's knowledge and experience, there also may need to be a discussion about the main clinical symptoms of the condition and disease progression. The other thing to mention, as I mentioned before, was that ALS-MND can be linked with frontotemporal dementia. So some genes can be associated with other disease risk too. And that's important to be aware of. It may be more than just ALS-MND and FTD. So on to the next point, use privacy and storage of results now and in the future. And this is poached directly from the standards of practice that I proposed. So discussing how results would form part of the client's medical record, whether results would be shared if the client passes away, and whether the results could be shared with family members or health professionals involved in the care of family members to provide accurate genetic counselling. All of these points may need to be confirmed and clarified depending on the results once they are available, and I guess individualised to that person in the context of what their result is. And a lot of the information here is information that could be supported by resources that may need to be developed as well. So it's important for me to flag, because we know that clinicians don't have all the time in the world, and this is a lot of content to cover as well when providing genetic counselling. So I think there's an opportunity for more resources to be available, which are not a substitute for any genetic counselling. I'll go through kind of the more exploration that happens over the next few slides, but it's something that certainly could help support someone in providing genetic counselling. Okay, so on to the next one. This is a big one and sometimes can take up some time depending on the context as well. So really providing information, but also exploring the possible practical, clinical and emotional implications of genetic testing. That's already quite a lot. And it's about the implications not only for the person having genetic testing, but also other people who the genetic testing results might impact, including at-risk relatives or carers or support people, for example, who may be responsible for sharing this information with other family members. There's a lot of different aspects that might be considered here, like insurance, financial life and family planning implications. For some people, genetic testing can impact on many different aspects of their life, and for others, it's one key area where they may be interested. For example, one of the common reasons why people do proceed with testing is for information, not only for themselves, but also for other relatives. such as children or future children if they are thinking about reproductive planning. And then for other people, it might be about helping them plan, how they live their life in the future. If there is an increased risk of developing MND, would they want to do things differently in their life or do things sooner? And then the next is really talking about the implications. Would there be any changes to management if a pathogenic variant is confirmed? For example, being eligible for research studies or clinical trials. As I mentioned before, a positive result, so the detection of a pathogenic variant, does not guarantee that there will be any changes to medical management. And it's important to be aware of that. And for some people, it might inform what kind of testing they might choose to do, for example, in diagnostic testing. So instead of maybe testing 30 or 40 genes that can be associated with ALS MND, maybe look at doing testing for the genes that are known to have supported clinical trials, for example. Also, the emotional responses to each possible genetic testing result. So it's important to highlight that there can be mixed emotions for the variety of different test results that you can get. So if we're thinking about diagnostic testing, a positive result for some people can provide an answer for what's been happening in their family and a tool to be able to be used by other family members to inform them about their risk and their planning. But it also can be a heavy burden knowing this information. So these two things need to be weighed up. And I guess, in predictive testing where someone's getting a yes or no answer, often there can be more of a focus on, what will it mean to have this result confirmed? How will this affect my day-to-day, depression, anxiety, etc.? But when you're from a family with inherited forms of MND, a negative result can also require time to respond. And there may be feelings of guilt, for example, depending on, the context of the family history. Of course, the implications of genetic testing are that there can be genetic risk for relatives if a pathogenic variant is identified. So it's important for that information to be shared and perhaps explored as well. And I'll talk a bit more about the family in the next slide. So just about the family, I think it's clear that genetic testing can undeniably be a family affair, and for many, but not all people, the family is certainly at the forefront of genetic counselling and testing decision making. Firstly, we do, as genetic counsellors, like to look at the family history. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a perfect tool for risk assessment because we know that people with, apparently no family history with apparently sporadic disease might still have an underlying pathogenic variant. But it can really help provide information about the likelihood that a variant might be detected and whether other genes or conditions should be evaluated. Can also, I guess, help to inform us and the laboratory about how the result should be interpreted in the context of the patient's personal and family history. Now, the next part is family communication, which is potentially a big exploration topic. So family dynamics are absolutely unique to each family, and this can come in when we talk about family communication. So exploring whether the client plans to communicate with other family members about the testing and all the results, and the possible risks and benefits of communicating to them that a pathogenic variant has been identified. Our job is to help facilitate that if we can. So offering support to help further family discussion. In most jurisdictions, although it is changing, I guess one thing to say is in some jurisdictions, there can be a legal obligation to share the potential risk of a pathogenic variant. So it's important for that to be known about and discussed with the client when undergoing genetic counselling. And when I use the term client in genetic counselling, I guess I am not specifically saying, for example, the person with ALS FTD, because in diagnostic testing, sometimes the client could be the person with ALS FTD or MND. it could be their support person who's helping make the decision, or is kind of the key communicator due to cognitive issues. And sometimes, clients might decide that they don't want to, people with ALS or MND may decide that they may, not want to know about the genetic testing, but want to ensure that it's available for other family members. So there might be a at-risk relative who takes on the role of the client in the diagnostic testing process. So the next point is access to social, community and or individual support from within and outside the family. So it's always worth exploring that, and that might be something that happens outside of genetic counselling, just as part of usual care. So overall, depending on the client's needs, this and the previous slide, which talks about the implications, may include a brief discussion before testing and a more detailed discussion after testing, but it's absolutely client and case specific. So it's always important for me to talk about these as considerations for discussion both before and after testing. So the next point is about ensuring. So an informed and considered decision has been made about genetic testing, so that the client understands all potential consequences, advantages and disadvantages of testing. Misconceptions and expectations are identified and clarified. The timing of testing, the client's psychosocial readiness and ability to cope has been considered, and that information about the option of genetic testing is provided in a non-directive manner. And following on from that, the client is aware of the voluntary nature of genetic testing, so they can opt out at any time, even if genetic testing is underway, and that there are alternative options. So they can choose to consider DNA banking, for example, which is basically storing their DNA for future, deciding to defer testing, or having testing but not receiving the results, having testing but then electing someone else receive their results instead. There are different alternative options that may be considered on case-by-case basis. Each of these has their own considerations, I guess, because it's thinking about the risks of potential disclosure, for example, if the client decides not to find out their results, but other family members know, for example. And the final point is that counselling is client and family centred, and that there is the option of additional appointments. And these additional appointments can be with the same or a different health professional. And the overall goal of the genetic counselling is really to ensure that there's space to raise questions, doubts and concerns. Clients have the opportunity to express and explore their responses to the information provided, and to help facilitate adjustment and integrate results into their daily life. So it doesn't just end with just giving the results. Ideally, there is ongoing genetic counselling available if it is required. And then finally, before I finish up and open it up for questions, there were some approaches to practice that are probably pretty standard, hopefully, in health anyway, but it certainly came up a lot in my interviews and the survey as well, that there should be support or information resources available throughout in response to the client's needs. And there might be online information, support resources, support groups, or referrals to relevant organisations, and they can be a source of kind of further support and information to help either at the time of counselling or in the future. That information is provided in a variety of formats. So for some people, it might be a verbal discussion and a written summary. There might be visual aids that might be useful. And at minimum, there should be at least a written summary of the discussion, at least at one time point along the genetic counselling journey. And finally, there should be contact details for the team available to contact in future, because things change, and for families where there is genetic ALS MND, there can be different questions along the way depending on different ages and diagnosis in the family. So that's me covering the main points. Thank you very much. I couldn't have done any of this research and really reflected on all this without the input of the study participants, my PhD supervisors and my colleagues. And I've got my email there and my Twitter handle as well. And I'm certainly hoping that I can answer some questions now. I hope this was valuable. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that presentation. And we have had a few questions come in the chat, in the question and answer, and also via email. We won't have time to answer them all, but we will definitely go through some. In terms of the chat, we had a comment made that I'd like you to comment on, which is one of the participants said when her father was diagnosed, he was told we all needed genetic counseling and none of us should have children. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not the first time I've heard that. So that's something that came up in the interviews that I had with some of the participants, and that is absolutely not what I, as a genetic counsellor, would ever say. I think genetic counselling is always an option, and children is always an option as well. And you know, our job in genetic counselling is not to tell people what to do, whether it's about having children or having genetic testing. It's really about making informed decisions that are right for them, and consider, you know, the nuance that we're all human beings that have different things, and we all have several pathogenic variants. So yeah, I'm shocked, but unfortunately not too shocked by that.
Thank you. And I will turn to one of the questions that came in through the Q&A. And Marcella asked us, is genetic testing done specifically in the 36 plus genes identified? If so, if the results come back negative, there's still a possibility of not having tested new genes. Therefore, the results won't be 100% certain. Can you comment on that, and also comment in general about the discovery of future genes and how historically those are dealt with?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. So even where we see families where there is absolutely inherited MND in the family, we've seen generation after generation where there is MND, only, well, maybe about 70% of those families will have a currently known gene or pathogenic variant in one of those genes. So we know that for those people, even, you know, 30% based on our current knowledge and technology will not be found. So although getting a result where a number of genes have been tested and it is negative is certainly very reassuring. It's not 100% because our technology is only good as it is today. And I mean, as someone who studied genetic counselling, you know, over a decade ago now, all of the, I guess, technology that was used for testing then has changed. So it is a very much evolving area where, you know, there might be something available in the future that might reveal something. In saying that, different laboratories have different, I guess, DNA storage options and options for retesting. This varies depending on location. So I can't talk to all laboratories and testing processes, but sometimes there is the option of having your DNA kept for future reanalysis as gene discovery increases our knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much. I just, this is a question from myself. Whenever a health professional speaks in sentences from research or from clinical practice, they often have sentences that mean something to them, but may not mean something to the layperson that is exactly the same as what their understanding is. So I just wondered if you could go into a little more detail about what it means when you say to be a part of the client's medical record. What does that imply for me as a person living with ALS or a family member for the future?
Great question. So in different areas, there are different rules regarding how genetic testing or genetic information is stored in one's medical record. So in some parts of the world, traditionally, genetic testing results were kept separate to the patient's medical record because their medical record is about them, but genetic records also tell us about their family as well. I would have to say that generally, in my experience anyway, genetic information is becoming more likely to be stored in your own medical record. So that's along with, your doctor's letters and blood tests, etc. And it means that if down the track you wish to gain access to those records, or a family member wish to gain access to those records if you've passed away, for example, depending on the law of that particular area, there may be the opportunity for those family members to have access to those records in the future. Does that help a little bit, Kathy?
Helpful. Yes, very helpful. Thank you. Another area that you touched on a lot was resources, and you provided some resources that we've shared in the chat. I did want to mention that after our genetic summit at the Alliance a year ago, not the one we did this year, that we developed some webinars and also some infographics that go into a lot of detail about inheritance and the fundamental understanding of ALS, MND genetics, and also genetic counseling and the implications of genetic counseling from an ethical perspective. And those are all available on our website. So if people want to go and do a deep dive, we have both those infographics available and the webinars as well to support a lot of the topics that you talked about today. Those are all available in English, and I just wonder if you happen to know of any resources that are available in other languages.
Unfortunately, I can't think of any direct ALS MND resources, although in saying that, through the study that I conducted, I did engage with a lot of people from not only English-speaking countries, but other countries as well. So it's possible there may be some information that I'm not aware of. But I'm glad you mentioned the Alliance resources, because they are also very useful and certainly a really valuable kind of starting point for that discussion and understanding.
I do want to ask one more Alliance directed question, which is, what, in your opinion, can be done to help alleviate the situation that we talked about right at the beginning, which is, obviously the utopia is to have access for every individual to genetic counseling at the time of diagnosis, no matter where they are in the world and what language they speak and so on. And then we have the other end of the continuum right now where people don't have access at all to counseling and testing, and genetic counselors don't even necessarily exist in every country in the world. As a profession, it's not recognized everywhere in the world. So what can we as a global community, as individuals and as organizations that belong to the Alliance do to push the needle forward on this?
That's a big question, Kathy.
Sorry.
But I'll do my best in answering. I think it's something that has come up a lot in being involved in the Genetic Summit and everything, seeing that it's a really big issue. And even, having my experience in Australia, depending on where you are, you have absolutely different access. I wonder whether there are opportunities to maybe become a bit more global in how we think about genetic counselling in some ways, because, this is one area where a lot of the genetic counselling I conduct is by telehealth, so by video. So those physical barriers can be cut down, and genetic testing laboratories are becoming more global in that, often laboratories have the option of doing a saliva swab instead of doing a blood test, which do eliminate some of those barriers. So I think there's opportunities for us to think about this in a more global way, but ensuring that there are kind of local champions because of the region-specific issues that might come up with insurance and different things like that. Certainly might be an opportunity to work with laboratories who might have some interest, or, you know, companies like Biogen, for example, who have, you know, clinical trials specific for genetic MND. So I think there's an opportunity. I just don't know what the best answer is.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. I know it was a very big question, so I apologize for that, but that is exactly what I was looking for. And perfect segue, because you did touch on insurance, to another question that came in through the Q&A. How do we prevent genetic discrimination for people that test positive to a genetic variant for insurance companies?
Yeah. That is a question that's probably quite specific to different countries. So in Australia and America, I know there's GINA in America, and there are the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act in America, and in Australia we have a moratorium on life insurance and different things like that. So there needs to be buy-in, I guess, to have rules in place to ensure that there is no discrimination over something that is completely outside of one's control.
Can you touch just quickly? I know we're running out of time, and I still have about 3 or 4 questions here. Can you touch quickly on the difference between having your samples taken for research versus for your own purposes?
Sure. So there's certainly a lot of research being conducted in this area, which is fantastic. And a lot of research that is conducted is almost done for the greater good rather than providing individual feedback to people. Some research studies can be conducted with genetic samples, and in some genetic research studies, there is the possibility of results being fed back to people. We know that research genetic testing is useful, but not as, I guess, I'm trying to think of the word, not as, I guess, clinically detailed as some of the clinical testing that might happen in an accredited laboratories. So when research genetic testing is conducted, usually the recommendation would be to ensure that it's a absolutely confirmed result in a clinical testing laboratory. So I guess if you are participating in genetic research, it's worth finding out whether or not you are expecting to receive results, and whether there's genetic counselling involved as part of that, what the process would be. And also, if you only have a research result, then hopefully being guided about ways to access clinical testing in an accredited laboratory.
All right, and going to a completely different topic. I'm sorry for like peppering these questions in a different way, but it's how they came in. One of the questions that we had was more about the family dynamic that you talked about on your slide, and that is, how do you deal with a family who might have varied opinions about what they want to do with the genetic results that they receive, and where there's a very strong disagreement about how much should be disclosed or not disclosed?
Yeah, completely. It's very tricky, and often it becomes a bit of an ethical issue where you might be thinking about you know, different factors like people's autonomy, right to know, the potential benefits, the potential risks, and you know, justice for all as well. And it can be really tricky, particularly if they don't align with different family members. So, for example, if I'm meeting someone who is has a grandparent who has genetic MND, but their parent doesn't want to know, but they want to find out for themselves, then that becomes a true ethical dilemma, and it's really weighing up, well, how do we move on from here, and thinking about all the potential alternatives that could happen. And you know, sometimes it is a matter of sitting someone down, for example, in that situation, sitting down that parent and talking to them about, you know, your child actually wants to know this information. you know, would you be willing to consider having testing, or would you be willing to, you know, sign a contract not to receive results, different things like that, to try and work through all the complexities that come. And that's our bread and butter in genetic counselling. Certainly don't have an easy answer for it, but it's something we certainly think about and try and work through with the people in front of us to come to the best possible outcome of something that's quite complicated.
I'm sure it's an alchemy of many different disciplines that you have to bring to bear in situations like that in the family dynamic. So thank you for that. Just one last, we are out of time, but I will ask this one last question that just came in. Is there a relationship between, okay, I'm going to have struggle with this word, consanguineous marriage and the incidence of ALS? And could public awareness about genetic transmission reduce the incidence of ALS? And so we'll end on that question.
Good question. Okay, so about the consanguineous relationship. So most genetic forms of ALS are dominant, meaning that it doesn't have a higher impact in consanguineous relationships where, you know, close relatives are having children. So if it was a recessive condition where both parents had to be carriers, then there would be a higher incidence. And the next part of the question was, could public awareness about genetic transmission reduce the incidence of ALS? Yeah, I guess through reproductive testing, if you were to prevent passing on a genetic fault, then yes, theoretically you would be reducing the incidence of ALS in future generations by ensuring that it's not passed on. But of course, ALS-MND is complicated, and genetic forms of ALS-MND are not, you know, they're a small part of the puzzle of ALS-MND in total.
Thank you so much, Ashley. We really appreciate you sharing this information with our community and taking the time today. Just a reminder that Ashley's in Australia, so this is very late at night for her. So we really appreciate her staying up to help inform our community and provide so many resources. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat, and I would like to echo those that we really appreciate your support of the Alliance and the global community and educating us about genetic counseling and testing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.